Now, every speaker will have about 20 minutes for their presentations, after which we will open the floor to Q&A. That's a standard format, both for our in-person audience and those joining us online. And of course, I will do my best to strictly manage the time. As Marcus said, you're not here to ask questions, you're here to enforce traffic control. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sydney to the podium.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be back in Canberra because I haven't been back since before COVID. And I love Canberra. I never agreed with people who said it was the most isolated capital in the world next to Pyongyang. I'm here to talk about the politicization of the security sector under Jokowi. And I think that we're dealing with a legacy that is probably going to continue and perhaps deepen under Prabowo. Jokowi started out by letting both the TNI and the police exploit his inexperience and his lack of interest in security affairs. But in the process, he grew to control them both pretty firmly, but he did so in two very different ways. For the police, he actually turned it into an extension of presidential power, very much through his own personal appointments. And with the TNI, he focused more on giving them basically complete latitude to do whatever they wanted. It was a hands-off approach to let them pursue their institutional goals, which included clawing back power from the police, finding jobs for unemployed officers, expanding into the civilian sphere, which was one way of dealing with the unemployed officers, strengthening the territorial command structure, and increasing the budget. On the other hand, he came to see the police as a tool for rewarding friends and intimidating opponents. I think we heard this morning in detail about what some of his coercive tactics actually were. His trajectory over his 10 years in office can be tracked by his appointments or attempt at appointments at the beginning of his tenure and at the end. In the beginning, in the period of the first 2 years, 2014 to 2016, he was basically wholly within Megawati's political stranglehold, and he nominated her choices for the top two jobs in the security sector. First, the arch-conservative Ria Mizard, who was a holdover from the New Order, and secondly, the PDIP stalwart political strategist and police liaison to the DP heir, Budi Gunawan. These weren't Jokowi's men. At the end, the two people in charge of the military and the police were Jokowi's old allies from Solo who overlapped with him in the 2009 to 2011 period. So very much people who got their job because and only because of the association with Jokowi. If you look at the politicization that took place under Jokowi, you can divide it into four phases. First, there was that first 2 years, the early period, where Jokowi was finding his feet and came across as a weak and ineffectual president, at least for the first year, carried over to some degree in the second year. Secondly, the post-Ahok period through the 2019 elections, which saw his growing use of the police for political ends. Then we had the COVID years, 2020-2021, where for the first time his attention really focused on the military, and you began to see the politicization of the military, which up till that point had been more a phenomenon of the police than the TNI. And then finally, the last 3 years, 2021 to 2024, up through the present, where it's really a question of power consolidation and the way that he used the security sector, again, to achieve his ends. So the first phase was marked by the fiasco of the failed effort to appoint Budi Gunawan at Mega's insistence to become the chief of police. And as you all know, as soon as Jokowi was about to make the appointment, the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, indicted Budi Gunawan for corruption because of major signs of unusual wealth, including the fact that his son had an $18 million bank account for doing no known work. And then this led Jokowi to withdraw the nomination. Only Budi Gunawan fought back, managed to criminalize and bring criminal charges against the KPK commissioners, then got himself appointed as deputy police chief, and then ended up as head of BIN, which he remains to this day. For a while, up until the tensions between Jokowi and PDIP came to the breaking point, Budi Gunawan was one of the most powerful people in Jokowi's government. The second phase was the period of 2016 to 2019, when we began to see Jokowi showing growing confidence, but also a growing sense of the need to confront enemies. Jokowi appointed Tito Karnavian as the police chief in July 2016, an appointment that at the time seemed based on merit, although it also seemed based on a bond that Tito had developed with Luhut Panjaitan. But it ended up having major political implications. It was Tito in this period, more than Jokowi himself, who ended up politicizing the police force, in part because Tito had political ambitions. I think he wanted to be president, and he was testing the ground to see whether he could build a political base to achieve this. Marcus, I think, referred to the Tito's desire to end direct elections, especially at the local level. And I think this was because he wanted to control the local elections in a way that he could build up a personal political base in a way that he couldn't through direct elections because he had no party base. But anyway, his decision was to try and build up his political capital by showing himself to be a Jokowi loyalist. He came into power just as the anti-Ahok protests were gathering steam, and the police quickly became an indispensable tool in Jokowi's strategy to undermine the Islamists through what Greg Feely has called repressive pluralism. And you'll hear more about that from Nava. But basically criminalizing the organizers of the anti-Ahok movement and essentially equating Islamist radicalism with subversion. This realization that the police could be a critical tool against political enemies became more pronounced during the 2019 elections, when Tito became convinced, ironically in retrospect, that a Prabowo victory would be disaster for the police. He therefore abandoned any pretense at police neutrality and pulled out all the stops to secure a Jokowi victory and disrupt the Prabowo campaign using online tactics as well as physical repression against pro-Prabowo supporters and pro-Prabowo rallies. It's at this point, after Jokowi was successfully reelected, that Tito was appointed or rewarded with the position of Minister of Home Affairs, and thereafter basically slid into oblivion because he never regained the influence that he had when he was chief of police. This period is much more about police politicization than it is about the TNI, but the military continued to benefit throughout from Jokowi's non-interference and his own relations with the military, Jokowi's own relations with the military, improved substantially after he began getting his own loyalists in as Panglima from late 2017 onwards. Now, we had the appointment of Prabowo as Minister of Defense in 2019, and we can all wait for Marcus's book to get the details on this. But the interesting fact here is that we had in Prabowo a much more active and assertive Minister of Defense than we'd had in the past, and that meant that the TNI's and the Ministry of Defense's own institutional goals were pursued with more vigor than ever, and led eventually to the mutually beneficial relationship of Jokowi and Prabowo that ended in the winning of the Prabowo-Gibran ticket. Now, the third phase was the COVID years from 2020 to 2021. These years saw both the military and police exploit the pandemic to further those institutional goals, with the top people appointed belatedly to deal with the crisis coming all from the TNI. The pandemic provided an opportunity to showcase the continued utility of the territorial command structure, find jobs, new jobs for unemployed soldiers, revive the role of the Babinsa, and in general play an increasingly large role in the civilian sector, which had already begun even under the SBY period with the signing of the MOUs with various ministries, turning, for example, in the MOU with the Agricultural Ministry, soldiers into agricultural extension agents. Jokowi continued to use the police and the new crime of violating COVID protocols against Islamist enemies, as we saw with the arrest of Habib Rizk and the execution of his bodyguards after a highway chase. The killings of those guards at Kilo Limapulu, also highlighted the near total lack of accountability of the police for crimes which served the president's ends. The end of this period was marked by the appointment of Listo Sigit Prabowo, no relation to the other Prabowo, as police chief, whose only credential was his relationship with Jokowi. And the appointment showed how quickly a single individual can transform an institution into his own bailiwick through key appointments and with presidential support, despite starting out with almost no support from the rank and file of the police. The last 3 years of 2021 to 2024 were the culmination of Jokowi's politicization of the police through the use of coercive tactics. This was a period that was marked by scandal after scandal in the police involving unexplained wealth, drug use, high-flying lifestyles, and murders and cover-ups. And finally, in October 2022, with the inappropriate use of tear gas in a closed football stadium that led to the death of 130 people, and again, for which there was very little police accountability. It led to the plummeting of an already low standing of the police in the public eye. And this is when Jokowi, in one of his more cynical moves, called a meeting of all police heads and including the chief of police, and basically gave them a dressing down, saying that the lack of public confidence in the police had become a real serious problem and the police needed to shape up. This is from a man whose lack of interest in police reform, who's turning a blind eye to corruption and abuse, and whose utter lack of interest in police accountability had led the police to this point. And then we had the elections in 2024. And as we've seen from Sana and Eve this morning, this was probably the most blatant use of the police in an election that we had seen from the beginning of the reform era. Tito's use of the police in 2019 to get a Jokowi victory was a very different story than Listio's in 2024. In 2019, Tito at least had had an institutional goal as well as a personal one, because he believed that a pro victory would marginalize the police and put them under a ministry instead of reporting directly to the president, a fear that is still current among police to this day, even though Prabowo has said he won't do that. But in 2024, it was all about securing a victory for his patron when Listio went to town to try and secure a victory for Prabowo and for Gibran. So they resorted to all sorts of tactics, including threatening village heads with charges of corruption, as we heard the corruption being instrumentalized as a tool by Jokowi more generally, threatening them with corruption charges unless they produced a Prabowo victory. Even the police intelligence being used to document which local officials were actually supporting another candidate, particularly Ganjar, and this was particularly prominent in Central Java. And if they were supporting Ganjar, then there would be approaches made to suggest that if they continued on failing to support the Prabowo ticket, then they too would face corruption charges. There was also, as you may remember, the pressuring of university rectors to produce videos that portrayed Jokowi in positive terms. I'm not exactly sure what the ultimate aim of this was, except to ensure that university rectors were on board, and they did what they needed to prevent student demonstrations as the elections drew closer. And then there were some carrots, in a way, as well, by providing funding for people to attend rallies and so on. So throughout this period of Jokowi's term, we did see a rise in police and TNI budgets. In 2018, they almost got close to each other, although they've since diverged and the TNI budget continues to be higher. But as noted before, these were increased budgets which led to probably somewhat more support for Jokowi within the two services, but they still were low compared to what other countries see as an appropriate budget as a percentage of GDP. Now, Jokowi's term is ending with these two bills which are highly problematic: a TNI bill to reform the earlier TNI bill, which would allow for what some people call the return of dwi-fungsi, although it's not quite that, but it basically would allow active duty military personnel to serve in civil positions across government agencies if the president determines that there is a need for this. And this will clearly allow for a much greater role of TNI in civilian roles. It also ends the ban on military businesses, whereas the police bill allows for more intervention and surveillance of internet correspondence, social media, and allows for a crackdown on the internet more generally in the name of national security, but very broadly defined. And this is clearly increasing anxiety among those who are already concerned about the decline of civil liberties. So in conclusion, Jokowi changed the security sector for the worse by removing safeguards, reducing checks and balances, and weakening democratic oversight. There was never any interest in civilian control of the military throughout the Jokowi period. But his tenure also shows how critical appointments can be to the politicization of the security forces. It also means, however, that if it is a case of one person being appointed to a key job, then in a way that's hope that you could have a reformer at some stage appointed who could undo some of the negative things that have happened in the police. It would be an uphill battle, but a person can make a difference. Within the TNI, however, the changes have been more institutional. And if you have institutional changes that push the military more into civilian roles, it's going to be much harder to push them back into the barracks. Thank you.